So the biggest thing for me was there was just this tiny spark inside that says, maybe I am worth actually living a life I love to live. Just maybe. There has to be something that I was put here for and a reason that I can go on.
Hey, Flip Your Script listeners, it's Kristi Piehl. Today's guest has found healing after a deeply traumatic experience. If you have kids in the car, you may want to listen to this later. And if you're working through your own healing journey, this episode could be triggering for you. For the last 6 years, Quintina Sonnie has lived in freedom after being trafficked and exploited. Quintina, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so honored to be here.
And your story is one that really will shed light on folks, because before we get to the healing part of your life story and where you are right now, I think it's important for people to understand the trafficking part and the exploitation part, because most people think, yeah, that stuff doesn't happen here. And that doesn't happen to people I know. And that's a whole separate thing that doesn't touch my life. And I have done enough understanding and learning in this area. I know that that's lies, but I think that's lies we tell ourselves so we don't have to think about what really can happen to quote unquote regular people. So why don't you tell us how no one chooses this, how this happened to you?
Yeah, so I'll start at the very beginning because I think it's really important to kind of understand someone's potential background, where they may seem to come from the normal nuclear family that has everything together, and then behind closed doors, things are a complete mess, which I personally feel is something that has plagued, especially the States, which is where my trafficking took place. And everybody thinks like, oh, that's for a foreign country or, something crazy. But no, it happened in the United States, in Colorado, actually. But I want to go back to the beginning of my childhood, where my biological mother, was not able to take care of me. So the first abandonment that I ever really experienced was from her. And it was complicated because I was adopted as an infant by my grandmother, so my mother's mother. And while I still had a maternal figure who was steady in my life, took care of me, there was always something missing in that maternal bond. And my mother could not step up to the plate to be the mom that I really wanted her to be ultimately. And that is just part of the separation that we felt. From a very young age, I learned that my place as a girl and as a woman is to please men. My boundaries are meant to be crossed. I don't get to say no. And even if I didn't realize that it was a bad thing, I think that a really hard topic for a lot of young girls who have suffered from sexual abuse, especially by a relative, my body didn't recognize that I was being abused because I seemed to seek it out. And it was because of my abandonment that I, as a 5, 6, 7, 8, 9-year-old, would seek out sexual attention from this uncle who would readily give it to me because of his past. And so I think that there's a really big misconception about what abuse might look like for the child. So I carried a lot of shame around when I got older and started to realize like, whoa, wait, like that's not okay for like uncles to have those types of relationships with their nieces. Like that's not cool. And then I felt a lot of shame and guilt around that whole experience. So that further made me feel like, okay, well, now I'm like tainted. Now, like nobody's going to want me. So now I can just go and be promiscuous and do whatever I want. So naturally that led me into promiscuity, especially in high school. And I actually never had like the boyfriend that was really like a solid boyfriend. I had a lot of guys who kind of just took advantage of me because I was easy. And it was, something that was very simple for me to do in that way because I was able to completely disconnect my worth as a woman from the acts that I was doing with my partners. So fast forward, my grandmother actually died when I was 10. So I moved in with some cousins. We did not get along. It was not a good place for me to be at. They didn't understand how to handle a child with all of these past traumas. And of course, I'm just sitting here looking for love. That's all I wanted. I just wanted someone to love me like my grandma did. And the thing was, nobody was going to, because they couldn't. She was not. She was that very special person to me. So we didn't get along. And then their friends actually took me. So that's how I ended up in Minnesota. Originally, I was born in Pennsylvania. And they took me in. They took care of me. They did the best that they could. And, you know, I was 13 at that point when they got me. So I was a whole person by then. You know, my prefrontal cortex is like partially developed. I'm, you know, having all these horrible coping skills from adults not being able to help me through those coping mechanisms in my early childhood. So now it's like, okay, I kind of took a break from the outward promiscuity and really like kept it hidden. So it wasn't really this out thing that everybody knew about. So when I finally got into adulthood, I went off on my own adventures. I was like, you know what? I don't want to ruin any more maternal relationships. I already felt like I had continuously been like the common denominator between these relationships of like maternal figures constantly leaving me. That abandonment wound kept getting like open and then like put salt in, and then they like tried to stitch it up and it got infected. Like it was just a terrible process to go through. So finally I moved to Colorado with a friend and her husband. We are no longer friends anymore. They did some terrible things. That's a whole other story. But eventually I ended up in jail. And they finally released me after 6 weeks because I didn't do anything. And I was left homeless, jobless, carless at that point. But I was like, I have to do something. And I was a cosmetologist, was a nail tech at a salon. And I was like, I just have to do something. I have to figure out what the heck I'm going to do. So I took all my nail gear and I just started walking down the street. And mind you, we moved into Colorado on April 1st. By June 3rd, I was in jail and I didn't get out until July 16th.
So at this point, you're what, like 19 about age-wise?
Yeah, so I was 19, turning 20, and I had no idea where I was. I had been in jail for the 6 weeks that 6 out of the 10 weeks that we had even been to Colorado. So I had no idea what I was doing. I was like walking around, just trying to figure out what the heck I was supposed to do with all of my nail stuff, and just going to see if I could find a pawn shop that would allow me to sell some of my stuff to them, because I was homeless, jobless, now carless. It was terrible. I had nothing to my name. So I figured, you know what? I'm just going to go walk down the street and I'm going to see if I can find a pawn shop that will take some of my stuff. And so as I'm walking down, I'm used to getting catcalled. So normally I don't really pay attention, but for some reason, I heard somebody beeping and yelling at me. And so I turn around and it is this beautiful man in this dark green Lexus. And I'm just like, oh, hi there. And at this point, I have nothing to lose. I am literally the most down and out you could ever be. And so he sees that I saw him and he pulls into the gas station across the street and waves me over. So I'm like, oh, well, like, I'll just go ahead and see what he wants. And I go over and he's just like trying to make stupid jokes like, oh, you look really hot. And I like looked at him. He's like, I mean, because it's hot outside. Like, you're beautiful, but I mean, like, you're hot. And I was like, yeah, it's pretty hot out here. And he's like, where are you going with like all that stuff? And I was like, oh, I'm just trying to find a pawn shop. Of course I said, I'm not really from around here. Like the perfect thing to say. And he's like, oh, like, let me give you a ride. Like, if you want, I know it's super hot. Like, my car, whatever. So I was like, sure, it's fine. Cool. Like, can you take me to some pawn shops? Do you know where they are? He's like, oh yeah, like I have a GPS. We can just stick it in there. This was back in the day when you didn't have it like pulled up on your phone.
Just so people who are listening, I think what I've read about trauma is that for many, many people, the minute that the gentleman who says, let me drive you around, if you had a quote unquote healthy childhood and healthy relationships, that sends off warning bells and you might be calling 911. But based on your background and based on your situation, the warning alarm that might go off for someone else did not go off for you because of all the things that you had experienced up till this point. Therefore, you got in with him and weren't afraid, concerned, thinking he might do whatever he ended up doing to you, correct?
Absolutely. I mean, at this point, I literally said in my head, which is actually really ironic when we get to the part where I actually ended up exiting. I literally said, I don't even care if he shoots me at this point. Like, what do I have? Literally, what do I have where I can't go anywhere? I can't tell my parents because they won't help me. They were kind of like the tough love parents, which totally get, but it was like, I have nothing. So why not get in the car? So yeah, absolutely. Anybody else would have total warning bells. I was like at the point where I didn't even care. And at that point, if he did do something, at least it wouldn't be my fault. And like in my head, I wouldn't have to take myself out. Somebody else would do it for me. And then I would like release the guilt of that. So there was like a lot going on in my mind, like to really paint the picture of like where I was at. I mean, I had just gotten out of jail for something I didn't even do. I spent 6 weeks in there. I've never been in trouble other than like one minor thing when I was 18, really stupid. And so like for me to be in a place like jail for that long, I mean, that already had broken me down. I was completely at a point where it was like the choiceless choice. And like, I always say when I talk about my story and I talk about choice specifically, I'm always like, would you rather eat or eat garbage? Like both are disgusting. Like you have to pick one because you have to eat, right? So at this point, I'm having to choose between the two. It's either be homeless or get in the car with the guy and hope he doesn't kill me. Or maybe if he does, like, I honestly don't care at this point. So as we're driving around, he's like, of course, asking me these seemingly completely normal questions that you would just like ask to get to know somebody. Where are you from? What do you do? How'd you get down here? All these things. And of course, you also have to realize like I naturally, when I was growing up with my grandma, I'm always been a very free spirit. So my grandma very much encouraged that. So in my formative years, my grandma it's like she told me about stranger danger, but she also told me to like be nice to people. And like, she didn't give me the talk of like, she kind of made it feel like everybody is like a good person until they give you a reason to not think they're a good person. Like listen to your intuition, but like give people the benefit of the doubt. And I've always been that way, just always giving people, 10 points and then you knock them down as you go instead of starting at 0 and having to build it up, which has its pros and cons in itself. But I decided that, I was just going to sit there and tell him all the things and ended up not having anything sell because nobody wants nail stuff in a pawn shop. And so at the end of all of this, it's kind of getting late and he's like, well, all the pawn shops are like closing down. Like, do you want me to take you back home? Like, what do you do? And I was like, well, I don't really have a home. I just like sleep in my car. He's like, oh, that's not okay. Like a beautiful girl like you can't sleep out in your car. Let me get you a hotel room. And I was like, lit. I get a shower, I get a bed, like this nice. He also fed me. I'm like, I have food, I have shelter, and I get to take a shower. Of course, for me in my head, I'm like, oh, well, if he does all of these things for me, he's going to expect something from me. So of course, I offer up favors for the exchange, and he's like, totally willing because we're both apparently attracted to each other in that way. And so it's like, where do you draw the line? So for me, it started out with survival sex. And a lot of people don't realize that they're even involved in survival sex. If it's not a full body yes in a sexual endeavor, some sort of intercourse or any sexual favors that you are participating in, if it is not a full consensual yes, and you are doing it because you will get something in return, that is survival sex. And so, it's very nuanced and kind of complicated in that way, but a lot of people skip over survival sex because they just think, oh, well, you're only a prostitute if you trade sex for money. And it's like, no, it's force, fraud, and coercion with favors in return for something like money, but also could be basic needs, shelter, food, stability, whatever, even love. So there is this really big stigma out there around like who fits into the category of being a victim and who's perpetrating, right?
Would you say in that moment, based on all the things, were you a victim at that point in your definition?
Definitely. I was forced, frauded, and coerced to do these things. And of course, in my head, back then, I wouldn't have said that I was a victim. I wouldn't have said, I would have been like, oh, but I chose this. I chose to do it. But did I really? Like,
you had no choice.
Were my other options? Exactly. Like, what were my other options? So, again, the choiceless choice. After that comes the next day, we wake up and he's like, so like, do you have to do something? Like, what do you want to do? And I was like, well, I'd really like to go get some clothes from my car. He said, perfect, we can go do that. We go to get the clothes out of my car. My car is gone. It had been towed or something, but basically I feel like my car was stolen by the guy that I used to be with. But yeah, it just ended up being gone. I tried to report it stolen. They were like, well, if you think he has it, then, he's going to be pulled out at gunpoint, blah, blah, blah. And so they like made me feel bad about reporting my car stolen. So I didn't. And I just let it go and I never saw it again. So then after that, I'm like, I really have nothing now. I have no car. I have no leverage. I don't even have freaking clothes now. Like, and all my precious belongings were in there.
So Green Lexus man pulls up, talks with you. And you're 19, 20. He's how old?
Mm-hmm. When I left him, he was 33. So yeah, he would have been like 31, going on 31.
So it wasn't, because I think that I personally, my bias is that some really creepy old guy pulled up to you. And I wanted to clarify the picture in the head is that this is a relationship that age-wise would have been perhaps socially accepted.
Totally. Then I didn't even find out his actual age until a couple months into our relationship. And these events that I'm explaining right now, this is literally over a day. So this is 24 hours that all of this is happening in succession. And it's like, I want to like point out all these different things because it really builds the picture of like how deep and entangled I was in this and how easy it is to slip into this lifestyle and to be victimized and to be pushed into this. So with him, we arrive at my car, realize that it's not there anymore. I have nothing at this point. So now he's like, well, what are you going to do? And I was like, for some reason, and I think it's because I had heard from a young age that my own biological mother had also participated in survival sex and also was also trafficked. So I think that this idea kind of came from what I knew my own biological mother had done in her lifetime. But I was like, you know what? I'm just going to go walk the track. And he's like, do you even know what that means? Because I had told him up until this point, like, I came from a very wealthy family. I went to a really prestigious high school, like all these different things. Like I came from a really good family. And so he's sitting there like, do you even know what that means? And I was like, well, I mean, it can't be that hard. Like, don't you just stand on the street corner and wait for people to come to you and you just get in their car? And he's like, no, that's not how that works. And he was like, you know what? How about this? If you want to do that, I'm not going to stop you, but I have a better idea. And I was like, oh, great. Better idea. Sure. What's that? Like, duh. And he's like, how about I help you post online? And I was like, you can post online? What do you mean? Like, isn't that dangerous? And he's like, well, no, like, you go on Backpage, you just set it up like it's a friendly meetup, like you're just looking for, conversation and fun, but everybody knows what really happens.
Again, like for someone who hasn't had all the 20 years up to this point, they're with a guy and they might wake up and say, "Oh boy, I wish I didn't have to do that." And then the minute that the guy starts teaching you about how to set up an account on Backpage, the warning bells would go off again. Like, maybe this isn't someone I want to hang out with. But again, I think the decades of trauma and abandonment and pain that you'd suffered brings you to this point where, again, you're not saying this is a terrible idea. You're saying like, not a bad idea.
Yeah, to me, it was better than standing on the street corner. Like, I'm like, oh, that's so much easier. And then and then at that point, I got to pick who I wanted to go to and like, whatever. So to me, it was like a no-brainer. And I knew he would be there. He's like, I'll protect you. I'll take you to all the dates. Like, you don't have to worry. I'll be outside waiting for you. And I was like, perfect. I have my bodyguard. I can go get some money. Like, everything's going to be good. I'm going to have shelter. I'm going to have food. I'm going to have all my things. Right. And so, he posed it like it was my idea, because he literally said to me, if you're going to do that, let me give you a different option. Because he already saw in that moment, he was like, I have her. She's hooked. It's like, it doesn't even matter. I could do anything I want right now, and she's already in it. So, and yeah, for me, that seemed like a good idea. But for anyone else, it would totally be like, no, don't do that. But when you're somebody who has been abandoned so many times, and then finally, especially after everything that I had just been through those last couple of months, going to jail, my parents not helping, them not believing that I didn't actually do anything to be in jail, things like that. It was like, I just felt the abandonment all over again. And it was like this nice guy who is feeding me, giving me shelter, showing me affection and attention. Any woman who has been through what I have been through, and even lesser than that, I mean, just wanting somebody to love you and care about you and just ask you questions like they care, that's enough for a lot of women, especially if they have a history of trauma.
So he basically, at that point, he knows that he has you. And he probably, when you were walking down the street, knew that you were someone who could easily, you were a good victim, right? If you're someone who's a perpetrator, you make a good victim because you have nothing and you have no one there. And he could probably spot, I'm guessing it wasn't his first go around with this sort of thing. So he could tell that you were going to be someone who could be pulled in, not that difficultly, into this kind of life. But at what point did you realize that you were no longer making choices and he was making choices, and you had even less choice than when you were walking down the street the first time?
Yeah. So that moment actually wouldn't happen until about 3.5 years later. So yeah. And just to like reiterate, when it was like I had to put up a facade. And the crazy thing is, I actually had a full-time job. I got another job after that. I had a full-time job as a salon manager, and I was working full-time. And also, when I wasn't at work, I was out doing dates. And so it was like, I had this whole one side of me, because that's the whole reason I even got the job, was to kind of make a facade. Because if it's like, if you're not working and you're having all this money come in, someone's going to question you, you're going to get some weird looks, especially from my family. So I was like, oh, well, if I get a job and then, and anybody calls at night anyway, you don't really do a lot of like daytime dates. So it was like the perfect scenario for me to be able to have this facade during the day and do what I needed to do during the night. And so it really paints the picture of like how deep I really was in the illusion that this man has created for me. And it was like, he kept telling me, we're not going to do this forever. It's only going to be a couple months. If we just make 10 grand, we'll invest it and then you don't have to do it anymore. And it was like that goalpost kept being pushed and pushed and pushed. And it was like, well, you didn't go out this night, or, you only had this many dates this night. We're not at 10 grand yet. And I didn't think to count, I didn't think to like count the money, because I trusted this man. Like I trusted him with the financials, because I had messed up my financials completely for my whole entire life. So I'm like, okay, this man's older than me. He knows what he's doing, everything's gonna be fine. So that's just kind of how it all played out. And so 3.5 years later, we actually had, in the life, we call them wife-in-laws, but basically it's just another woman that is also being victimized and trafficked. You share the homestead, and she was the only one that I could not scare away. I scared all the other ones away because I wanted him to be mine. I saw him as my boyfriend, that I did these other things for us. I did it for us. Everything that I did was for me and him to, persevere and get out of the rat race and, live this lavish life that he kept promising and promising and promising. Well, I started to realize that she was getting just as much attention, if not more, than I was, because she didn't have a day job. So when I was at my job, I knew that they were home alone. I'm not stupid. I know what's going on when I'm not there, because you're not going to do it while I'm there in front of my face. So I'm sitting there like just writhing with rage, thinking about the fact that I am, and this is just another term that we use, I'm bottom. And that means that I am the one who brings in the most money. I'm the one that, call him daddy, if daddy's not available to make a decision, then it's me that the decision falls on. And I am the second in command for the stable. Like, that's just how it works. And I'm also, if I'm bringing in the most money and being bottom and having that queen title, then I should also be having queen treatment. Well, I'm thinking that I'm not getting treated the way that I should be as a bottom, if I'm understanding it correctly in my own head, the way he's describing this situation to me. And so I just start getting angrier and angrier and angrier. And I actually, and this is an important part, seems kind of out of place, but I'm going to share it anyway. I actually switched my birth control. So I had the implant on, which is the one that goes in your arm. And then I went back to get it again, and they didn't have the implant on. So I got the Nexplant on, and that one made me completely insane. I'm not really an angry person. Anger is something that you really have to push my buttons to get me to. But when I got that Nexplant on in, it was like next level rage, could not control it. And the one thing that you don't do in the life is you do not talk back to daddy. It doesn't matter how mad you are. Doesn't matter like what the situation is. You do not talk back. And one day I came home and I had just had it. And I just unleashed my rage onto him. And I said, you're a blankety blank blank, all these things. And when I had gotten angry in the past, or when I felt like I wanted to leave, I would do the dumb thing where I would like get in my car and drive around the block and be like, I have nowhere to go. So I would just go right back. But this time I was just too angry. So I'm just letting it all loose. And he puts me in a chokehold. And when he lets me go, it didn't even faze me, didn't even care, got right back up, started screaming at him again. So then he pulls out, this is going to be trauma trigger warning for anybody who's suffered from domestic violence. He pulled out the pistol that he always kept under the couch cushion, and he pushed it against my forehead. And he said, if you don't shut the up, I'm going to kill you. And at that moment, I didn't even care. I just kept screaming at him, do it, do it. Like, and you have to recognize, like, I am at the breaking point. I don't even have my man anymore. I feel like this other woman is like taking my spot. I have nothing. I'm still 3.5 years later when I kept getting promised it was only going to be a couple months. Like, I'm fed up. And so I didn't even care, which is so ironic that when I got in the car that day, remember I said that, like, I don't even care if he shoots me at this point. And then just like 3.5 years later, like, here's my whole epiphany moment of like, oh, like, this is real. Like, he really could kill me right now. So he doesn't, obviously I'm still here. So everything fizzled out. He just choked me out again. And at that point, I was like, okay, I'm going to have to just be compliant. Like, I have nothing. I can't do anything at this point. I just have to pretend like everything's back to normal. And that's what I did for a couple of weeks. But what I was doing is, by this point, he had actually stopped taking me to my dates. He would only take my wife-in-law on her dates. He had actually let me have one of the cars that we had, and that's what I would go by myself at this point, which was another reason I was so angry, because I'm like, I have to go to these buyers' houses by myself. So what I started doing was I would text my regulars and be like, hey, like, how you feeling? Like, want to meet up? And so I would just be like, hey, like, I got a call. He would be like, what's the address? And I would give him some blank address that I didn't even know. And it was one that I had already been to before, so he wasn't suspicious. And he was like, okay. And then I would go. And sometimes I would tell him it was a blank call, which means that nothing happened. I didn't get any money. And I would just stash that money in different places. And then at work, we had the cash tips, and then we had the credit card tips. And I always had to write on the receipt what my credit card and cash tips were. And I would just hide my cash tips from him in my drawer at work. So by the time I had finally gotten the chance to leave, I had a little bit of money stacked up so that I wasn't completely like down and out.
Your story is so much, and I think there's a lot of folks who are just having that much detail, I think, is really helpful for people who hear about someone in that life and jump to all of these conclusions. So I think let's take a break, and then we'll come back. And the part that will help anyone from trying to understand to empathy to whatever they're dealing with in their own life is the flip your script from that feeling you have the choiceless choice to healing, because that is a massive shift for someone who doesn't know what love should feel like, what love looks like, what a real relationship is like. And you got there. And many people end up dying in that life, or going from that to homelessness to some other really unhealthy situation, because they just can't get to well. And you got to well. Flip Your Script is produced by Media Minefield, an agency specializing in earned, owned, and paid media. With clients all over North America, Media Minefield was founded on the belief every story has value, and the power of a story is unlocked when it's shared. Oh yeah, Media Minefield's my favorite agency because I started it in 2010 when my 12-year television news career ended. I won some Emmy Awards, got to tell some incredible stories, met some amazing people, and then I was laid off. And that's enough of my Flip Your Script story. You can hear it and others by subscribing to the podcast. And if you like what you hear, don't forget to rate and review. And now back to today's guest. So we've been hearing Quintina's story, and it's heartbreaking, whether you have those types of experiences or know someone who has, just to hear it and to hear the pain and the feeling of having nowhere to go and no other choice. And at some point, as we just heard, Quintina found a way. She found a way, right? She hid some things. She put her life back in danger, because had he found out that she was doing things, she squirreling money away essentially and lying, she would have been in big trouble. But she got to the point where she had the confidence and the courage to say, you know what, I got to figure out how to get out of this. And I'm on my own. So I'm going to make my own path. So you get to the point where you have enough money and you're going to leave, and you got from 3.5 years of this to the place you are now, where you have a relationship that's healthy, you help other people heal, and you would say you're in a good place. How did that happen?
So the biggest thing for me was there was just this tiny spark inside that says, maybe I am worth actually living a life I love to live. Just maybe. There has to be something that I was put here for, and a reason that I can go on. And so that brought me back to Minnesota. back into a normal like work life balance, I was like all of a sudden kind of jolted with the idea to look up quantum physics of all things. And my dad is a chemical engineer, so he's super sciencey, but I have always been more like esoteric and very much like into the crystals and all that stuff. And so I was like, you know what? I don't know why, but I feel like I'm going to deep dive into quantum physics. And I am so glad that I did, because there is a science aspect to quantum physics. Obviously, when you hear that, you automatically think like, whoa, that's like way over my head. And, that sounds really complicated. But when you look at it from a perspective of more spiritual and esoteric, you actually start to see the parallels between the science aspect and what we were really put here to do, and the way that we were created to interact with the world. And so that kind of led me down the path to also looking at neuro-linguistic programming and how the brain works. I was like, you know what? I can see that I have based a lot of my decisions off of complete trauma responses. And I didn't really have words for it at the time, but that's kind of what I knew inherently. And I was like, I want to fix this. I want to be the beacon of light and show other women, or, anybody who has experienced exploitation of any kind, that they don't have to become a statistic. I didn't want to be the person who turned into the victim. I didn't want to stay the victim. And so I was like, you know what? This is what's going to give me the actual heart and the courage to step into the healing journey. And that's not easy for people, because, when you have to face the dark side of yourself, which is a part of the healing journey, it's not just all rainbows and love and light. There's a lot of shadow aspects that we have to look at. And that was the scariest part for me. And that's where I knew I had to start first. So I decided to start talk therapy, which was really, really incredible. Breaking Free actually set that up for me. And at first I was a volunteer at Breaking Free. I didn't actually identify as a victim of trafficking. I just looked up organizations, nonprofits that help women, something about like sex trafficking or something. I just was Googling it because I felt like I just want to help women. I want to show them that they can get out too. And Breaking Free was the first one that popped up.
I think it's really remarkable that you leave it, you come back to where you have some roots, and you think that you want to help someone else, not realizing the depth at which you had to face some of the darkness and face the trauma. And you went first to how can I help someone else? And you found this nonprofit that then helped walk you through the journey. Is that accurate?
Yeah, exactly. And I got into Breaking Free's Sisters of Survival program, which is like a 14-week. You show up every week, they feed you, we talk about the dynamics of trafficking and also domestic sexual exploitation, which is technically what I would say that I experienced was domestic sexual exploitation. And so we really broke it all down. And in that class is when I realized, oh my gosh, that's what happened to me. And so it was such a beautiful thing to first go from volunteering to wanting to actually go to the class, because originally they had this speakers program. It was called Speakers Bureau. And I really wanted to be a part of that. And they were like, well, you have to go through SOS first, and then you can do Speakers Bureau, because I wanted to do talks, and I wanted to be on stages and all the things, talking about my experience. And they were like, well, go through this first. And that only then is when I realized that, oh my gosh, that's exactly what I've been through. That this is, now I have a name to say, I was victimized, and I don't have to carry around all of the shame that comes with this lifestyle. And especially because most people would say that I chose to be in that life. And while technically, yes, sure, I decided that I was going to do that, there was so much behind it that didn't allow me to make rational decisions. And so when I started to study the brain, I started to realize, oh my gosh, 95% of our behavior is based off of our subconscious. And the subconscious is in tandem, they run together with the nervous system. And the nervous system is ruled by trauma if you don't heal it. So I was like, wow, all of my decisions that I made were out of a trauma response, not because I actually consciously chose to be in the life. So after that, I was just like, wow, this has opened up a whole new thing for me. I did actually stay in the beauty industry for another 5 or 6 years, but then I just eventually, as my knowledge developed and as I started to make the parallels between my experience and what I was learning and my own healing journey, I was like, you know what, this is perfect. This is the perfect thing for me to segue into. So now that's what I do. I talk about the unconscious mind, and I talk about the importance of healing the trauma so that you can make conscious choices. That is what my whole basis of everything was. And I didn't even realize that choice was really what I wanted, because I felt like through my whole entire life, I really didn't get to make choice. I really just had all these trauma responses that made it seem like I was in control and seemed like I had choice. But in reality, it was completely unconscious. And I was just rolling with my nervous system's punches, so to speak. So yeah, that's how I got into that.
Bravo for seeking the help, and also for nonprofits, news organizations like Breaking Free that are out there helping, because you really can turn someone's life completely around and to find the worth and the value. And when I think about your full story, I think about all the people. I mean, you start with your mom and the uncle, but then there were all these other people who had someone shown up and said, you know what, honey, you don't have to be treated like this. If one of the gentlemen in gentleman is too nice of a word. If one of the dudes, I would use harsher words, but I won't. One of those guys in 7th, 8th, 9th grade would have said, "Let me value you for more than the backseat of my car," or whatever, and you maybe would have had a picture of health. Instead of the trauma, there were all a teacher, someone, like there are all these people when you were a child who could have come in. And of course they didn't know, and you're not talking about it at that age. But boy, if a great boyfriend would have been there, I don't know. That's the part too that I think for those of us that didn't have that experience, we perhaps are in the path of someone like you or some family like yours where we could step in and just offer love and show support and model what love actually looks like. Of course, love isn't perfect and there is no right way to do it, but you saw a lot of the wrong way to do it. So that's the part that I think, we can support nonprofits. Absolutely. We should be hearing stories like yours so we can educate ourselves and not go from what you shared to, oh, pretty woman, look at how amazing this life is. But what the reality of it is. So I say all of that to say, how can those of us who hear your story step in and help someone like yourself, or get to the value and worth that you and the light you have inside of you earlier? Does that make sense? All of that?
It totally does. Yes, absolutely. And I think that's such an important question, because definitely if somebody would have just asked me, and it's like I was saying it in so many words, but I didn't have, as a kid and as a young adult, I didn't have the words to explain what I had gone through. So if you are seeing somebody with this more like erratic, maybe even promiscuous, or just needing some additional love, just ask them if they're okay. If somebody would have just stepped in and said, "Hey, how are you? I know you've been through a lot. It must have been really, really hard for you when you lost your mom." And, and nobody knew about my uncle, but they knew a lot of other aspects of my life, the abuse that I suffered at the hands of my second set of parents and things like that. If somebody would have just said, "Hey, like, do you want to talk about your grandma?" If somebody would have just asked me or let me know that they cared about me and they cared about what I had been through, I promise you, I would have never felt like I needed to accept that kind of treatment from anybody. And I think we shy away from tough topics when it's uncomfortable because it's like, well, this is a kid. Like, I don't want to like re-traumatize them. But I think it's more traumatizing if you don't let them talk about it, if you don't bring it up, if you don't ask about it, any situation like that.
Well, and to your point, I think people look at behaviors and they judge behaviors, and then they would go to this place of, tell me why you're doing X behavior. When really the question to ask someone is, tell me what's going on in your life. Tell me more about what happened when you're a kid. Tell me more about, can you share your story? Because the rest of the behavior part, most people are not equipped. We're not therapists. We're not equipped to deal with the actual helping someone through a trauma. But if you could have gotten with someone who would have said, tell me how you're doing, and someone could have at least had a light go on, hey, this little girl needs help, and gotten you into some help, and gotten you to the professionals, you could have had a different turn in your life. Absolutely.
Just that level of support, because most of the time, most of the women, at least the ones that I've talked to, other survivor sisters of mine, most of us grew up without that like super special bond with our mother, or we had a really tumultuous relationship with a father figure in our life, or maybe he was absent or whatever. Like once you don't have that solid family structure, it can really open up a lot of abandonment. But it's important to open up those conversations and just show people that you love and care about them.
Thank you. That was well said. I so appreciate you sharing your story and showing the vulnerability and sharing the different aspects of the story, because without these details, without this information, it is easy to judge folks, and it's really hard to not, and frankly, to look away. And when you hear someone's story and you hear the context of their lived experience, it's so helpful. And I appreciate how you are able to share and help others, and how you've healed. And I'll ask the final question is one that we ask everyone on the podcast, which is there a quote, a mantra, a lyric, something that has helped you as you've traveled through the healing journey?
Yes. And actually this one popped up just with the conversation that we just had. And it's from Maya Angelou. It's literally one of my favorites. And she says, people will forget what you said to them. They'll forget what you did, but they will never forget how you made them feel. And I just think that speaks so much to just this conversation and what it entails. Like, we'll never forget how we felt in any situation. So yeah, that's a good one.
Thank you. We're going to put links to resources for folks who may need some help, who may want to support an organization like Breaking Free, your website. We're going to put all of that on the Flip Your Script podcast website. And I think about the whole conversation we'd had, and I wasn't thinking of sharing this, but I think it makes sense because we always have a Flip Your Script challenge. And this week, I think it's to reach out to someone. So there's a young woman, a friend of one of my sons, who reached out to me and wants to have lunch. And at first I thought, man, that's weird. I don't have time. And frankly, what do you want to talk to me about? And, oh, does your mother know? I mean, I went through all these places and I was going to ignore it. But after this conversation, we're going to finish, and I'm going to get the contact information, and I'm going to go talk to that young woman. And I have no idea where that conversation is going to go, but I think, we can't ignore, we can't look away. And if we could be someone that could step into someone at any part of their journey and say, man, you're worthy. I see you. I hear you. Let me love you. So thank you for sharing your story. My hope is Quintina's story empowers you to believe you're capable of more than you think, to discover motivation, to uncover inspiration, and to find the strength to turn the page.
Thank you for listening to Flip Your Script, hosted by Kristi Piehl and produced by Media Minefield. If you like our message, please be sure to give us a 5-star rating, subscribe to the show, and share our episodes with your family and friends. Do you or someone you know have a story about flipping your script? We'd love to share it. Contact us on our website, flipyourscriptpodcast.com. To stay up to date on all things Flip Your Script, make sure to follow host Kristi Piehl on social media. You can also check out the website for pictures, resources mentioned in the show, and other great episodes.